From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to today's program. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko met in Samarkand, Uzbekistan. And that was a very important meeting because during that meeting, the bilateral relationship was elevated to an all-weather comprehensive strategic partnership. Now, with President Lukashenko's state visit to China, where is the relationship headed next? Besides bilateral trade and investment cooperation, what can Belarus contribute to regional stability as a new member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? To talk about all this, Yauheni Preiherman joins us now from Minsk, Belarus. He's director of the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations. Also in Beijing, we have Zhang Xin, associate professor at the School of Politics and International Relations of East China Normal University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let me go to you, if I may, Yauheni, in Minsk, Belarus. This year, of course, marks the 31st anniversary of bilateral relations. We just saw President Lukashenko visiting China. He's actually wrapping up his visit on March the 2nd. What do Belarusians make of this visit, and what outcomes do you expect to come out of this summit?
Good morning from Minsk. Well, I think the visit is seen with great interest and very positively across Belarusian society. As probably any country in the world, Belarus is primarily interested in two realms, that is security and economy, and those two realms have traditionally driven our relations. And especially now that Eastern Europe is amid a crisis, both in terms of security and economy, I think this visit is seen with particular interest. I think the two countries have already covered quite a lot of ground in the 3 decades of their relations in terms of developing economic relations. And I see that the Belarusian president noted at every meeting that the trade volume between the two countries, all problems in the global economy and in Eastern Europe notwithstanding, has now reached a level which only a decade ago was difficult to imagine. And that, of course, reflects the progress in the relationship. And in terms of security, given that Belarus is next door to the war in Ukraine, and given the peace suggestions that Beijing has recently put forward, which are now widely discussed internationally, I think this is an additional factor which adds a lot to this visit, because those suggestions are very much to the liking, but also very much the ideas that Belarus has been promoting itself in the world. And these ideas are seen as a potential, well, let's say, potential answers to those dilemmas that drive the conflicts in the region.
Yeah, it has been a strong relationship, and you can tell from terminology. Terminology matters in diplomacy. Professor Zhang, bilateral relations are elevated to, quote-unquote, all-weather comprehensive strategic partnership. And we know that this is a rare designation in China's foreign policy. Only very, very few countries, such as Pakistan, was described by Beijing as all-weather comprehensive strategic cooperative partners. What does this designation mean to you, and what do you make of the current China-Belarusian relations?
The terminology definitely matters. As you just correctly point out, Belarus enjoyed this all-weather comprehensive strategic partnership with China, a level of diplomatic relation that's not used very often in China's diplomatic terminology. I think overall, the all-weather components indicate that officially, between the two states, both sides regarded their bilateral relations at a unique, significant level. That uniqueness means in all kinds of, regardless of the external environments, regardless of what happened between these two countries domestically, two countries look for comprehensive collaboration in a multiple different policy sphere. I think that's the basic message of the terminology. And I agree with our Belarusian colleagues' overall description. Bilateral official relations between two countries since early 1990s have developed rather smoothly. It starts with a very clear mutual respect for each country's basic concerns. That's the starting point for bilateral relations on an official level. Then it gradually and smoothly expands to a set of especially economic sectors and also social development. And now we see in a very difficult external context, the two governments decided to further elevate the bilateral relation to a new level. I think that's the overall pattern.
Yeah, but Professor Zhang, the Western media's coverage of President Lukashenko's visit to China is very narrowly focused. They focus on geopolitics. Their headline describes President Lukashenko as, quote unquote, Russia's ally, bringing the Russia-Ukraine crisis into the visit. What do you see as the West's main concerns or even fears about the visit? Actually, I want to ask this question to both of you. First of all, Professor Zhang.
Right. First of all, I think there's nothing wrong or nothing surprising to see a geopolitical element in any state visits. Right? That's what states do. So it's very natural and logical to have at least one element of geopolitical consideration in official visits. The second, I think it's way too narrow to define President Lukashenko's visit to China or the Belarusian-Chinese relation as completely dictated by the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian conflicts. Right? That's a significantly important geopolitical conflict in which I think Belarus does have a special relation to it. But between Belarus and China, there are tons of important issues that belong to a genuinely bilateral agenda. Right? So I think it's way too narrow to define this visit or Belarusian-Chinese relation as being completely dictated or dominated by the Russian-Ukrainian crisis.
Yauheni, in Minsk, Belarus, what do you think?
Well, I do agree. We know that the media usually tend to connect current developments, including such high-level visits, to the current media agenda. But of course, a visit of this scale has been in the making and in the planning for quite a long time, which already tells us that it does reflect many more developments in the bilateral relationship between Belarus and China than just joint thinking about the war in Ukraine. So I think it's only natural that this has to be taken into account when we analyze the nuances of this visit.
And then on February the 24th, China released its white paper, a position document on the Ukraine crisis, urging for a political settlement. How does the Chinese position paper come across to the Belarusians?
Very positively. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the ideas in this 12-point plan are generally very much in line with what Belarus thinks, and more importantly, with what Belarus itself has been promoting on the international arena for a couple of years. As you can imagine, being next door to Ukraine, we've been pretty much involved in the conflict development since 2014, when basically this very conflict started. And back then, Belarus was the internationally recognized neutral venue for talks. And those talks did take place in Belarus. And the Belarusian leadership would back then put forward quite a few ideas very much similar to China's vision. In this respect, I should say that even though the two countries are very different in terms of their international, let's say, roles, but also, very distance that is between Belarus and China, on these particular matters, not just on Ukraine, but broadly speaking on the future of international security, they can be very natural partners. And Belarus can become a proactive ally in promoting these ideas when it comes to discussions about what the international system, international security is going to look like in years and decades to come.
You're talking about international security. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO, is playing an increasingly important role. Actually, it is accepting new members. Iran is becoming a new member at SCO. And also in the Samarkand summit last year, Belarus was being accepted. Of course, there's a procedure internally and within the SCO to officially accept Belarus. Professor Zhang, when do you expect Belarus to become a full member of the SCO, and what will be the benefits for the SCO and for the Belarus?
For one, I think Belarusian government takes the former membership of SCO very seriously. We have seen consistent, strong interest in joining SCO from Belarus government's perspective over the years. Secondly, I think the earliest time we can expect to see the the beginning of a formal adoption of Belarus as a formal member SCO as early as this year's SCO summit, which will be held by India, but a specific date for that is not finalized yet. But as you correctly mentioned, there's some procedures we need to finish. And also, as someone who are involved in the expert level discussion of SCO, I recall correctly that as SCO decided to expand its membership, include India and Pakistan as a formal member a couple of years ago. When the topic comes up further expansion of SCO membership, Belarus was already on the list of countries that has the best conditions to be part of the SCO community. I think the adoption of Belarus as a possible full member really, to some extent, promote the expansion of SCO's own organizational agenda and the mandate to a large extent, to extend from the core of Central Asia with border security as the original major mandate, now gradually expand to a larger geographic coverage as well as a further extended organizational mandate.
Yeah, Yauheni, what do you think? What role can Belarus play in an SCO?
I think two specific features that Belarus will bring to the organization are, first of all, its geographic location is going to be obviously the first European country to join the SCO. And secondly, Belarus has been active with the organization for at least 10 or even more years in different roles that the organization allowed. And it's been promoting what I call a bridging agenda within the organization, trying to bridge geopolitically, but also geoeconomically, the Central Asian original focus of the organization and its broader potential to play in international affairs. And I think it's going to continue to play along those two main directions, and in a way that will indeed help to broaden and even change positively, I'll say, the mission of the organization. That's at least how it is seen from Minsk.
Great, Yauheni and Professor Zhang. We have more questions than we have time for them, but thank you for joining us at this hour, and come back again. Thank you. Meanwhile, tensions between the United States and China, already high, are climbing even higher as the so-called Select Committee on the Capitol Hill began its first hearing on how to further contain China. First, here's my take. You know, one thing I learned from covering Washington politics for 8 years is that politicians in D.C. love acronyms, love them. From POTUS to FLOTUS, from CARE Act to FAIR Act. So given the recent Chinese bloom incident over the United States, and given the collective rage against China displayed by both the Democrats and the Republicans, who agree on very little else these days, maybe it's time for a new acronym. Maybe the Congress should consider a Bonding Through Beijing Bashing Act, or BBB. Sorry, I know it's not a good idea to name a program that reminds people of another ill-fated one. I mean, Build Back Better was this beautiful promise on U.S. infrastructure, and it had been moving through the Senate for what, 3 years? Anyhow, the Bloom incident says a lot about the state of affairs in Washington. Getting tougher on China may not be the rational response to maximize American interests, but a necessary one politically. In fact, the United States was among the first countries to send blooms elsewhere. In January 1953, a total of 448 DWS-119L reconnaissance blooms were launched towards the former USSR, out of which about 380 blooms reached Soviet airspace. In July 1958, WS-461L blooms used the higher summer jet stream to fly into the former USSR, escorted by cover blooms or ones without cameras or other means of intelligence gathering. Now fast forward to 2022, according to China, the US flew spy blooms into Chinese airspace more than 10 times that year. We're not even talking about NSA surveillance programs. Remember PRISM, that collects stored internet communications based on demands made to internet companies such as Google? Or Stateroom, that is a highly secretive program intercepting international radio telecommunications and internet traffic in 100 US embassies and consulates worldwide. Robert Zoellick, former president of the World Bank and former US Deputy Secretary of State, said that Washington's reaction is a lost opportunity to improve ties. He said, afraid of looking soft on China, the Biden administration is failing to turn China's blunder into a diplomatic opportunity. Instead of postponing Secretary of State Antony Blinken's trip to China in protest, President Biden should have directed Blinken to present Chinese President Xi Jinping with recommendations to increase transparency and lessen dangers. It is a concern shared by others in that Biden's China policy is compromised over and over again by the need to please the Republicans, and that might be the case in the foreseeable future. Let's face it, Biden needs some political space to implement his China policy, which he originally intended, in which he says he does not want conflict or a new Cold War. And those China hawks could perhaps see China less through the xenophobic, chauvinistic, and belligerent lenses, and China's policies and intentions, of course, could be better communicated and understood too. Now, for more discussions, joining me from Henderson, Nevada, the United States, is William Li, Chief Economist at the Milken Institute. And in Beijing, China, we have Andy Mock, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. There is this select committee on, China Containment Act, basically. Of course, it has a fancier name, regarding China, managing China-U.S. strategic competition. First of all, I want to play you some thoughts from this committee.
It's not a polite tennis match. This is an existential struggle over what life will look like in the 21st century. And the most fundamental freedoms are at stake.
We must deter the aggression by the CCP. We do not want a war with the PRC, not a Cold War, not a hot war. We don't want a clash of civilizations, but we seek a durable peace, and that is why we have to deter aggression.
The economic policies of the Chinese Communist Party represent a clear and present danger to the American worker, our innovation base, and our national security.
So Andy Mock, let me go to you first. This select committee on the strategic competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. What do you make of that?
Well, Wang Guan, first of all, thanks for having me. This struck me as both delusional and alarming, and reminded me of the Glenn Close character in the movie Fatal Attraction, where she ends up not only hurting people around her, but herself. Because the delusion is, if you look at especially Matt Pottinger's opening statement, who, by the way, Matt is, I think, kind of the scheming puppet master pulling the strings behind a lot of this, is that there are these myths that China is not a communist country. It does not want to change the world. And through these secret speeches that they've discovered that China is all of these things. And, this is common knowledge for anyone that covers China, that China believes that its system works for itself, may have valuable lessons for others in the world. And there's no secret here. And, I think this delusion is really hurting the U.S. And, of course, hurting countries around the world as well. And, it's really sad that this is happening.
William Li in Nevada, what do you make of this committee? What does it do? Any bills that is passed? What is really the purpose of setting up yet another China-related committee on the Capitol Hill?
Well, Wang Guan, again, thank you for having me here. And I must say, Andy probably woke up on the wrong side of bed. I hear a lot of virulence and venom coming out of him in his interpretation of what was said. And from what I hear, the committee was set up because I think the U.S. government is recognizing that China has become a real stiff competitor to U.S. industry. And there's a lot of concern that there may be job losses and loss of market share to Chinese competitors. And I think the concern of the committee is that they're trying to protect U.S. workers, and they're trying to find out where is it that China has been so successful, and why is it that U.S. companies may or may not be able to compete as effectively. So I think a lot of the rhetoric is in preparation for the election campaign, because I think the Republicans are going to come out very strong, that they're there to protect the American worker. And I think the China is really being used as a vehicle to try to focus on what is needed to restructure the American economy and help American workers.
Well, Andy, do you want to respond?
Well, I don't disagree that certainly there is an element of these hearings to focus on increasing American competitiveness. And I certainly hope that that does happen. That's good for the United States. That's good for the world. But we have to look at the written record. So Matt Pottinger is quoted as saying the source of his antagonism towards China is China's efforts to subvert American power and influence, first in China, next in the region, and then the world. And I think what this implies, of course, is that he and perhaps others like him believe that the U.S. should rightfully exert power and influence in China. And this, again, I think goes back to my point that this is delusional and self-defeating.
Well, I think what Matt Pottinger didn't say is probably his anger towards China derived from his days as a Wall Street Journal reporter decades ago, and his many episodes with relevant people here in China. He's not going to say that, right? William Lee, what do you make of the fact that this committee is, saying that it wants to talk to the Wall Street firms to better understand the complexities of so-called de-risking or selective economic decoupling? Does this suggest that the trade war between China and the United States, or trade conflicts, whatever you call it, might escalate in the future?
Well, I think it reflects the fact that we don't have a viable framework for trade between the two largest countries in the world. And the failure of the trade negotiations during the Trump administration and the apparent failure of the Biden administration to get much further progress shows that we need to put something in place. And I think the concerns that are being expressed about national security and the desire to talk to Wall Street firms is to find out why is it that investments are not settling in on the United States to try to build up the semiconductor industry here, to build up more of the supply chain that COVID has taught us we cannot stretch out too far, and to diversify the U.S. economy so that we can produce more of the vital goods and services here in the United States. And I think the Wall Street firms' reply has been that a lot of the U.S. domestic regulations have made it very unfriendly to produce stuff here, and China has been a very friendly audience in welcoming foreign capital. And President Xi Jinping's latest speech has said, we do welcome foreign capital, and I think that is the tension that is facing U.S. Legislatures who have put in place a lot of regulations to incentivize firms to leave the United States, and at the same time, they want them to come back to produce the vital goods and services. So I think the tension is being heard here, and I don't think there's any kind of ulterior motive to try to put down China. In fact, it's a recognition that China has become a formidable competitor and is a fertile ground for a lot of foreign investments. So I think going forward, the problem that the U.S. legislatures have got to face, especially in this election year, is to elect officials who will recognize how global competition can be enhanced and to better both parties for customers and producers around the world.
Well, talking about chips, let me stay with you, William. The Department of Commerce has just announced that the U.S. chip makers operating in China cannot access a federal funding worth $39 billion. They have to halt their operations in China for at least a decade if they want to access this massive amount of fund. What do you make of that?
That's a great point. In fact, that's a great example. I should have used that as my example for why it is that the legislatures have to reassess themselves. They've learned in their discussions from the Wall Street firms and the private equity firms that investment is fungible. A dollar is a dollar, and the CHIPS Act was to provide a pool of money to incentivize large companies to produce chips here in the United States, to employ American workers, and to employ American engineers. And what they're trying to prevent, and the reason why they put these restrictive incentives in place, is to prevent firms from cutting back on investments and using the federal dollars and using the investment dollars that they would have put in place someplace else, like to invest in other plants in other parts of the world. So I think the fear of crowding out investments that would have taken place is something that these restrictions are designed to say, if you're going to make investments in the United States, you have to keep them in the United States, and they can't be substitutes for the kind of investments that you would have made here. And doing that is a very tricky thing, and the legislation that is put in place and its implementation through the administrators and the regulatory agencies is going to have to be very careful in designing the incentives so that we increase the pie that is being produced here and not just slice off more of it to be paid for by the U.S. government and less of it to be paid for by the shareholders.
Yeah. In China, we have a similar saying, make the pie bigger instead of dividing it only. Andy, more on the technology front, on Monday, the White House gave a 30-day deadline to government agencies to remove the popular app, TikTok, from federal devices and systems. In response, the Chinese Foreign Ministry said, and I quote, "How unsure of itself can the United States, the world's top superpower, be to fear a young person's favorite app to such a degree?" I mean, is the U.S. overreacting to TikTok fear?
I think it certainly is. And again, I think we come back to this idea of being delusional. And just very briefly, I want to add about the private equity part. We have to recognize that American private equity firms, hedge funds, VC firms invest in China not because they like China, but because the returns are attractive, and not just the gross returns, the risk-adjusted returns. And this benefits the limited partners or the pension funds, the insurance funds that give them the money. And this ultimately benefits the American people that rely on these investment returns for their retirements, for other important needs. So I think, again, this is very, very counterproductive. And the move with TikTok is the same. I think it's symbolic. Most of the users of TikTok are young, teenagers, probably not government workers. But still, it does signal a certain, I think, paranoia and a certain lack of confidence, Wang Guan. So I would agree with you there.
Yeah, I want to move gears and talk about Taiwan. Representative Mike Gallanfer, who is chairing the committee of managing the U.S.-China strategic competition, made a clandestine trip to Taiwan in February. He said that people in Taiwan told him they would welcome a so-called fact-finding trip by the committee on the possibility of the quote-unquote military invasion by Beijing. Is the committee really going to play the Taiwan card? William?
Well, I think the committee is concerned about the growing voices that are coming out of the foreign ministry that resound and endorse wolf warrior tactics and wolf warrior diplomacy. And I think there was concern, a growing concern in the United States that while nationalism is something that the U.S. would certainly favor, and the Chinese government has a lot to be proud of in its achievements of how quickly the economy has grown, this tone has shifted toward more belligerence and much more of a concern for the countries in the South China Seas about the growing militarism that's being present in the various islands in the South China Seas, as well as the overflights in Taiwan. And I think one of the things that the Republican committee is trying to demonstrate is that we still adhere to the long-standing policy that China and the U.S. has agreed to the last 40 years of recognizing that there is one China, there's a one China policy, that Taiwan itself is something that the U.S. will try to preserve the trade relations and other relationships with. So I think one of the things that we have to be aware of, though, is that the United States right now is concerned about the tone of voice that comes out of the foreign ministry and the increased sense of belligerence. And that has really caused not just the United States, but South Korea, Japan, Australia, India, to be concerned about what the intentions are of foreign policy and military policy in China.
I think in a nutshell, China's intentions are not always understood, and it needs to be better understood. So that's all the time we have, I'm afraid. Andy and William, thank you both so very much. That will do it for this edition of The Hub on CGTN. Thank you for tuning in. Our news coverage continues. Bye and take care.